The Picts are like the North American Indian. You've got a carving on a totem pole in America, and it has to be handed down through the generations, the story.
The Scottish Picts, the enigmatic warriors of ancient Scotland, have long been a riddle wrapped in legend, hidden in stone carvings, and whispered in old tales. Their true story has eluded historians. Until now, scientists have sequenced their DNA, and the results don't just rewrite history, they explode it. The Picts didn't vanish. They didn't fade away. So who were they, really? Scotland's ancient mystery. When people talk about old Scotland, the Picts always stand out. They were a group of early people who lived long before the idea of Scotland even existed. Historians believe they formed their own small kingdoms in the north and east of the land. They lived in the wild, cold side of the country, where the hills are sharp and the coastline is rough. Even today, many places in that region still carry names from their world. The first time the wider world heard about the Picts was through the Romans. The Romans wrote about them and used the word Picti, which means painted ones. They chose that name because they claimed the Picts covered their bodies with paint or markings. We do not know exactly how true that was, but it shows how different they looked to outsiders. To the Romans, the Picts were not only strange, but were also a real problem. You see, the Picts had a reputation for being tough fighters. The Romans came into Britain and took over a lot of land, but they could not break the Picts. The Picts knew the land better, moved fast, and fought in ways that surprised their enemies. Some Roman writers even warned others about how hard it was to face them. The Romans built walls to protect themselves, including the famous Hadrian's Wall. And still, the Picts kept pushing back. This constant resistance helped build their image as fearless warriors who refused to give in. But the Picts were more than fighters. They had a style that showed skill and deep thought. The best proof is the Pictish symbol stones. These stones stand in fields and on hills, covered with carved shapes, animals and signs.
This is our original stone. We call this the boar stone. So here's a boar here. There's a lion here.
Some symbols look like real, everyday things, while others seem completely unknown. No one has fully figured out what the symbols mean. The strange thing, though, is that the Picts left almost no written history. They did not write down their own story, so later people filled the silence with guesses and myths. But what were these myths? Before the DNA, before science stepped in, people spent more than 1,000 years guessing where the Picts came from. Since the Picts did not leave written records, later writers had to rely on stories, old memories, and their own imagination. This opened the door for many strange ideas. Some of these ideas came from real attempts to understand the past. Others came from fear, confusion, or the need to fill empty spaces with something that sounded exciting. One of the most famous early writers was Bede, a monk from the early Middle Ages. He lived far from the Pictish lands, but he wanted to explain who these people were. In his book, he wrote that the Picts came from a place he called Scythia. This was a wide region in the far northeast, somewhere around the Black Sea. To Bede, this made sense because it placed the Picts in a distant land that felt cold and hard, just like the part of Scotland they later lived in.
The Picts are an amazing group of people who lived in northern and western Scotland.
His story said the Picts sailed around Britain, tried to settle in Ireland, and then moved to Scotland when the Irish would not give them land. Even though we know this is not based on facts, Bede's version was repeated for hundreds of years, simply because there was nothing stronger to replace it. But other writers tried different ideas. Some said the Picts came from Thrace, a region near the edge of ancient Greece. This idea made the Picts sound like a forgotten branch of old European people. Another theory pointed to Hyperborea, a legendary land far to the north that the Greeks believed was home to strange and happy beings. A few medieval writers even placed the Picts on lost northern islands, places where the sun hardly set and where odd customs were said to grow. None of these theories had proof, though. People still liked them because they made the Picts sound wild, distant, and almost otherworldly. These stories survived for so long because no one had real evidence to push them aside. Without written records from the Picts themselves, There was nothing to compare these tales to. The lack of hard facts acted like an open field. Anyone could plant an idea there, and it could grow for centuries. Another reason the theories lasted was the appeal of the unknown. Medieval writers loved to connect real people with faraway places. It made the world feel bigger and more magical. As time passed, archaeologists tried to solve the puzzle. They dug up ancient houses, tools, and graves. They studied Pictish artwork and symbol stones. They compared them with objects from other old cultures. Still, they could not agree on a single answer. Nothing they found clearly pointed to Scythia, Thrace, Hyperborea, or any other far-off place. The Picts looked local, but the roots of their ancestors stayed hidden. So for many centuries, people could only guess. Every guess made the whole thing even more mysterious. And that long period of confusion is why the story of the Picts became one of the most debated origins in early European history. Finding the first Pict. For a long time, no one thought it would be possible to ever get DNA from people who lived in early Scotland. The soil in many parts of the country has high acid levels, which breaks down bone over time. When bones crumble, the DNA inside them disappears too. This made Scotland one of the hardest places for ancient DNA research. Scientists often opened old graves, only to find that the skeletons were too damaged to study. So when researchers decided to try again with new methods, they knew it was a risky project. Still, they pushed forward because unlocking Pictish DNA could answer questions that had remained open for more than 1,000 years.
So as I said, we're now looking at Pictish DNA.
Two sites became very important for this work. One was Lundin Links in Fife. The other was Ballintorre in Easter Ross. Both places held early graves that belonged to people from the first half of the first millennium. These sites had something special that gave scientists a small chance of success. Many of the burials were long cist burials. A long cist is a grave made from stone slabs placed around a body. The body is usually laid out straight and surrounded by stones that form a rectangular shape. These stone walls protect the bones better than simple soil. They cannot stop decay fully, but they can slow it down. This meant that some bones had survived in better condition than expected. Inside these graves, scientists found skull fragments that still held the petrous bone, a very dense part of the skull near the inner ear. The petrous bone is famous in ancient DNA research because it protects genetic material better than any other bone in the body. Even when the rest of the skeleton breaks apart, this small piece can keep enough DNA to study. So when the team found petrous bones at both sites, they knew they had a real shot. The research team was made up of scientists from Liverpool, John Moores University, and the University of Aberdeen. The lead author was Dr. Adeline Morris, who had spent years working on ancient DNA projects. Her team used some of the newest techniques for extraction and sequencing. In a clean lab, they drilled into the petrous bone to reach the tiny pocket where DNA hides. After that, they cleaned the powder, washed it with special solutions, and slowly pulled out small strands of genetic material. It was delicate work because a small mistake could ruin everything. But after many steps, the team finally had usable DNA. This study became the first to produce high-coverage genomes from Pictish people. That means the DNA was complete enough to give a clear picture of their genetic background. Out of 8 individuals sampled from the 2 sites, 2 gave full genomes. 7 also provided mitochondrial DNA, which comes from the maternal line. This kind of information helps track deep ancestry and movement over many generations. Once the DNA was ready, the team compared it with more than 8,300 ancient and modern genomes. This huge dataset allowed them to see where the Pictish samples fit in the wider story of Europe. Every comparison added new clues. Some matches showed long-term links with local Iron Age groups. Others showed how the Picts might have been connected to people from nearby regions, but not from the faraway places that old writers once suggested. The data let the scientists draw a clearer map of Pictish roots than anyone had ever done before. The process was not easy, though. Every step required patience, but the results were worth the wait. For the first time, The Picts were not just figures from old stories or carved stones. They now had a real genetic profile. This breakthrough opened the door to new studies and fresh questions. It also proved that even in places with harsh soil and broken bones, modern science can still pull voices out of the past. This was the moment when the Picts became more than a mystery. They became people we could finally study in detail, not through guesses or legends, but through the oldest record of all, their own DNA. The first bombshell. When the DNA results came out, the biggest shock we got was the revelation that the Picts were local. They were not from Scythia, Thrace, or any faraway land that writers once talked about. Their roots were in Britain itself, and those roots went very deep. This finding changed the story in a huge way, because it stood against more than 1,000 years of guesswork. The scientists compared the new genomes with many Iron Age samples from across Britain. The matches were strong. The Pictish DNA lined up smoothly with older groups that had lived in Britain long before Rome came. The connection was so clear that the team saw a steady line from prehistoric times into the early medieval period. This meant the Picts did not suddenly arrive from some distant place. They grew from people who had been on that land for thousands of years. They were part of the long story of the islands. Before this study, many people thought the Picts might be outsiders who arrived in a wave or came from a forgotten migration. This idea was popular because it sounded dramatic. It also seemed to explain why the Picts looked unusual to the Romans and why their symbols were so hard to understand. But the DNA did not support any of those old ideas. There was no sign of a big foreign group entering Scotland during the time when the Picts formed. There was no genetic signal from the east, the Black Sea area, or from southern Europe. There was nothing from the far north either. All the clues pointed to one place, Scotland itself. This discovery removed a huge part of the mystery. If the Picts were not new arrivals, then their culture must have grown inside Scotland. Their style, symbols, way of life, and their early kingdoms were shaped by the land they lived on, not by some unknown homeland far away. This made their culture richer, not smaller. It showed that early Scotland was creative, active, and full of its own ideas. The collapse of the foreign story also changed how people saw the Picts as a whole. For a long time, they were painted as strange outsiders who somehow appeared, fought hard, and then faded away. But when the DNA proved they were native, their story became more grounded. They were not a mystery tribe dropped into Scotland. They were the next chapter of the same people who had lived on the land since the Iron Age. Their art and symbols were part of that long chain. Their strength as fighters likely came from knowing their land deeply. Their identity was built from the soil beneath their feet. This truth also gave more weight to the idea that the Picts were influenced by local traditions that changed slowly over centuries. Their culture was not a quick change that came from a foreign group. It was a homegrown system that took time to form. The stones they carved, the way they buried their dead, and the early kingdoms they built all came from a long history inside Scotland.
Using several buildings, probably hall-type buildings, which is quite rare to find in Pictish architecture.
In a way, this discovery made the Picts feel less distant. They were not ghosts from a far corner of the world, but were people who carried the same ancient lines as others who lived in Britain long before written history. A genetic mismatch that makes no sense. When the DNA results were compared with modern people, the researchers expected something very clear. They thought the closest match to the ancient Picts would be people living in eastern Scotland today. That area was the heart of the old Pictish world. It held their kingdoms, stones, and many of their ancient graves. So it seemed obvious that modern people from that same region would share the most with them. But the data showed something no one saw coming. The closest modern matches were found in western Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and even in parts of Northumbria in northern England. That made the researchers stop and look again because it looked like a mistake. How could the strongest ties appear far from the old Pictish lands, while people in the east did not match as closely? To understand this, scientists had to look at what happened after the Pictish period. Eastern Scotland went through many big population changes. Anglo-Saxon groups moved into parts of the east during the early medieval period. These groups blended with the people already there and slowly changed the genetic picture of the region. Later, the Viking Age brought another major change. Norse settlers came in large numbers to the northern and eastern coasts. Some stayed for generations, and their arrival added new genetic lines that mixed deeply with the local population. Over time,
Viking burials through ancient DNA.
The human past in the world, how did we become who we are today?
these two waves changed the makeup of the East. As a result, the original genetic signal in that area became weaker. It was not erased, but it was mixed with so many new layers that it no longer stood out clearly. This made it harder for modern Eastern Scots to match strongly with the ancient Picts, even though the Picts once ruled much of that region. But the story in the West was very different. Western Scotland did not receive the same level of Anglo-Saxon or Viking settlement. It had movement and change, but nothing as heavy as what happened in the East. This allowed older genetic lines to survive with less disruption. The same is true for Wales and Northern Ireland. These regions kept many ancient patterns because they were not hit by the same kinds of mass arrivals. Northumbria also kept certain early lines that linked back to older British populations. When the Pictish DNA was compared with these places, the match was stronger because the ancient signal was still there. So the mystery was not really about the Picts. It was about what happened to the regions around them after they were gone. The places where the Picts once ruled went through huge changes that diluted the old genetic patterns. The places where the Picts never ruled kept those older patterns by accident. That is why the closest modern relatives of ancient Picts are found far from the old Pictish core. In the end, the paradox made perfect sense. The Pictish DNA survived best where the Picts themselves did not. History reshaped the people of Eastern Scotland, while the West held on to the deeper past. And that is why the match looks upside down today. Solving the matrilineal myth. One of the most enduring theories about the Picts is the claim that they inherited power through the mother's bloodline. Many people heard this story because of Bede. In his early medieval writing, he claimed that Pictish kings were chosen through the female line. He said that if there was any doubt about who should rule, the Picts looked at the mother's family to decide. This idea caught on quickly because it was unusual. It also made the Picts sound very different from their neighbors. For centuries, scholars repeated this idea. Some even pointed to strange patterns in the king lists to support it. A few king lists looked confusing, with names jumping in ways that did not fit normal father-to-son lines. Since there were gaps in the records, it was easy to imagine that the Picts had a special system. The theory became so common that many people saw it as one of the defining features of Pictish society. But when DNA entered the story, things changed. The new study from London Links gave scientists something they had never had before. It gave real genetic information from early Pictish individuals. The team looked at mitochondrial DNA, which is passed only through mothers. This type of DNA helps trace female lines over many generations.
Yeah, and then there's a layer of dense material right down at the bottom here. So you can see it's got a lattice.
If the Picts had a matrilineal system, or even a strong matrilocal tradition, we would expect to see patterns in the female line that match those ideas. The results did not show that at all. In fact, they pointed in the opposite direction. 7 individuals from London Links were tested for their maternal DNA. Instead of finding a shared line that ran through the community, the scientists found that each person had a completely different maternal lineage. 7 people, 7 separate female lines. There was no hint of a shared mother's line that stretched through the group. There was also no sign that women stayed in one place for generations. High diversity in the female line usually means that women moved into the community from many backgrounds. This is the exact opposite of a matrilocal system. If the Picts really used matrilineal succession, we would expect tighter clusters of maternal DNA. We would expect at least some matching lines. But the study showed that these people came from very mixed maternal origins. That makes it very unlikely that the Picts were matrilineal or even strongly matrilocal. So why did Bede's story spread so far? And why did later scholars think the king lists supported it? The answer may lie in politics, not genetics. Early medieval kingdoms often used marriage as a tool to form bonds with neighbors, to settle disputes, or to strengthen claims to land. Powerful women played important roles in this process. A marriage between ruling families could make a man's claim to power stronger. In some periods, a king might rise because he married into the right family. This could make it look like the mother's side mattered more. Over time, these political shifts may have been misunderstood as a formal rule. Another issue is that the king lists themselves are messy. They were written long after the events took place. They mix legend with fact and often leave out the reasons behind each change in power. If a king rose through marriage, the list might record the man's name, but not explain the political deal behind it. This creates a picture that seems odd, but the oddity does not prove a matrilineal system. It just shows that early politics were complicated. The DNA evidence is clear. The Picts did not pass power through the mother's line. Their society did not follow the system Bede described. The idea survived because it was repeated for centuries, not because it was true. Thanks to ancient DNA, one of the biggest Pictish myths is finally settled. What the DNA reveals about the Pictish language. One of the greatest puzzles of early Britain is the Pictish language. No long texts survived. There are no books, letters, or even poems written about it. All we have are place names, a few short inscriptions, and hints left on stones. Because the language vanished so completely,
This is a particularly fine example of a Class 1 Pictish symbol stone. The surface of the stone is natural.
people argued about it for more than 100 years. Some believed it was Celtic. Some said it was not even part of the Indo-European family. Others thought it might have been linked to the Brythonic branch, which later became Welsh. Before DNA studies, most arguments rested on weak clues. Scholars pointed to stones with symbols that looked unlike anything else in Britain. They believed these symbols showed a non-Indo-European language, and others looked at place names in the old Pictish lands and said they resembled Brythonic names. Still, the evidence was thin. Without actual written sentences, no one could be fully sure. Every guess had supporters, and each theory lasted for decades. This is where genetics began to help. DNA cannot tell us how a language sounded. It cannot give us words or grammar, but it can show us who ancient people were related to. And when a community is strongly connected to another group through deep ancestry, their languages often share the same roots. This is not a rule, but a pattern seen again and again in early Europe. When the new study mapped Pictish DNA, the results were clear. The ancient Picts clustered tightly with Iron Age Britons. Their closest links were not to people from the far north or the far east. Their ancestry looked the same as the ancestry of groups who spoke early Celtic languages in Britain long before the Pictish Age. This finding did not prove Pictish was Celtic, but it made the Celtic theory far stronger than before. More importantly, the genetic connection was closest to groups who spoke Brythonic. Brythonic later split into Welsh, Cumbric, and Cornish. These languages came from the west and north of Britain during the Iron Age. The Picts matched those populations more closely than any others. This created a strong line between Pictish ancestry and the people who spoke Brythonic languages. It gave weight to the idea that Pictish was not an odd outlier, but another branch within the same family. Archaeology also supports this picture. Some Pictish stones contain Ogham inscriptions. Ogham was used in early Irish and early Welsh regions. A number of these inscriptions show names that look Celtic. They may not be easy to read, but parts of them match patterns seen in other Celtic languages. This adds another point to the Brythonic theory. There are cultural links too. The Picts shared many traits with Brittonic-speaking groups. Their art, burial styles, and parts of their society looked much more like their neighbors to the west than any group outside Britain. When languages grow in close contact with similar cultures, the chances of them being related become higher. What DNA cannot do is settle every detail. It cannot tell us the sound of the Pictish language, It cannot tell us how sentences were formed, or what their words for simple things like water or fire were. It cannot rebuild grammar or meaning, but what it can do is clear the path. It can remove ideas that do not fit the ancestry. And in this case, the DNA results took the non-Indo-European theory and made it extremely unlikely. They also pushed aside the idea that Pictish came from some faraway group with a lost tongue. The DNA showed that the Picts were not outsiders. They were part of the long line of ancient Britons, and this means their language was almost certainly part of the Brittonic Celtic family. This places Pictish beside ancient Welsh, the lost language of Cumbric, and the early form of Cornish. The debate lasted for more than a century, but the genetics finally gave it shape. So far, the DNA studies have answered so many questions and speculations about the Picts, but one very important question is still left hanging. What really happened to the Picts? The truth of the vanishing. For a long time, people said the Picts vanished in the 9th century. The name itself almost disappears from written records after this time, which made it easy for later storytellers to claim something dramatic happened. Some even suggested that an outside force destroyed them, or pushed them out of their homeland. When you look closely at the evidence, this is not what happened at all. The story is far more ordinary and far more human. During the 9th century, a major political change took place in northern Britain. Kenneth MacAlpin, the king of the Scots of Dalriata, became the ruler of both the Gaels and the Picts. This event later became wrapped in legend, especially in the tale known as the Treason of Scone. According to this story, MacAlpin invited Pictish leaders to a feast and killed them to take power. It is the kind of tale that spreads easily because it is dramatic and simple, but historians who study the period do not see real evidence for such an event. The story first appears centuries later, long after the people who lived through the 9th century were gone. Most researchers agree that it is a legend created to fill the gap left by poorly written records. But archaeology gives a much clearer picture of what happened. Excavations across former Pictish regions do not show signs of mass destruction or a sudden break in settlement patterns.
They're destroying the infrastructure of it to build buildings and taking that material away somewhere else.
There is no layer of burned structures, replacement of local communities, and no sign that large groups of people were forced out. Instead, the buildings, farms, and burial customs show steady continuity. People kept living in the same places for generations, even after the name Pict stopped appearing in texts. Genetic research supports this view. DNA from early medieval skeletons in both Pictish and Gaelic areas shows no sign of population replacement. There is no genetic marker that separates Picts from Gaels in a clear way. Studies from the last decade have confirmed that these groups were part of the same broad population of northern Britain. This means there was no genocide and no invasion that wiped out one group and replaced it with another. The people did not go anywhere. Their descendants are still in Scotland today. So why did the name disappear? The best explanation is political change. When MacAlpin and his successors created the new kingdom of Alba, they ruled through Gaelic traditions, not Pictish ones. Gaelic became the language of power, law, and church influence. As this culture took the lead, people slowly adopted its language and customs. Over time, the label Pict stopped being used. This was not because the people vanished, but because the political world around them now spoke a different language and followed a different identity. The truth is simple. The Picts did not fade away or suffer a dramatic end. They became part of a new state, and their descendants became the Scots. The name may have changed, but the people remained. What are your thoughts on the Picts? Could uncovering their true identity make us rethink all the myths of the past? And if history can be rewritten from DNA, how reliable is anything we've been told? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please click on the next one on your screen.